Good evening, everybody. I want to begin by just quickly asking how everyone is. Staff? Got a thumbs up? Public? Good. Okay. And how about the commission? Bathroom calls. I was telling Joy that I saw at the Mariners game, you know, where they have the sections cheer. Maybe that's something we do here. We see which section cheers the loudest. I'm gonna hope commissioners are the loudest. Right, so I'd like to bring this meeting to order. It currently is 6:38 p.m. Tonight's meeting is a hybrid meeting. The planning policy is in person, but staff or members of the public may be attending virtually or in person. Comments at tonight's meeting may be made in person or virtually. For all who would like to speak during public comments, speak clearly and pause frequently. State your name each time before speaking. And if you are attending virtually by computer or by phone and would like to speak during public comments, in addition to the above, please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. And if you're having any technical issues, try joining the meeting using a different device, such as a smartphone or tablet. You can use the call-in information in the meeting invite to call into the meeting. Valerie, it appears we have a quorum, but I'll officially ask.
Yes, you have a quorum, Chair.
Thank you. And our first approval of minutes is because we forgot last time. We have a few different sets of minutes to approve. One thing I forgot to ask you, Stephen, is we can still do this by unanimous consent. I forgot to send you this email earlier today.
That's correct.
Okay. So we're going to begin with the June 23rd meeting minutes that were all provided in our packet. Does anyone have any changes or concerns with the June 23rd meeting? All right, hearing none, the meeting minutes are approved. July 20th, same question. Any concerns, any changes? The July 20th meeting minutes are approved. And finally, the July 28th meeting minutes. Again, any changes or concerns? All right, all the minutes are approved. We've taken care of all of our house cleaning. We are now going to move on to public comment. And this comment period is for the general public comments on items pertaining to the commission. These are not comments for the public hearing tonight, so please refrain from speaking about anything that has to do with the 5 different topics until later this evening. Otherwise, it will not be recorded in the record. Valerie, has anyone signed up to make general public comments?
Yes, the first speaker is Hussein Karam.
There we go. My name is Hossein Karam, Mr. Chair Voice, commissioners, lovely staff. Thanks for having me, giving me the opportunity to talk. I'm a local developer, and the general conversation that I want to have is about the general Title 18. I think we've been in a state of an emergency for over 2 years or going to 3 years. As a lot is happening, things are slow. I urge you to, although I know Planning Policy Commission is not the authority who does this, but just for the record that I feel that given the circumstances, what has happened to our economy, what's happened to state of emergency, I request the council to consider delaying for the existing projects, the Title 18 for 6 months. Today, I made sure none of my friends find out about this. That's why we don't have anybody here, which is good. I just met this gentleman here. He's just want to learn. So this is the general thing here. I'm very honored to be part of this process, and I know the Planning Policy Commission does not make such recommendations, but I just want to be on the record, and that's all, and a little more about the Title 18. Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Brandon. Sorry, I cannot read your last.
It's fine. I don't even know if this pertains to why I'm here, but I received an email. I own a bunch of food trucks in town, and the email was basically saying this would be a meeting regarding food truck rules and regs.
Sorry to interrupt you, Brandon. So that does actually have to do with the hearing tonight.
Perfect.
So hopefully you'll want to stick around, but you can get your voice put on the record.
Yeah.
So if you have any other general public comments for the good of the order for the commission itself, that's what we're doing right now. But
Yeah,
again,
until that comes up, I really have nothing else to say. So if you want to call on me when that portion of this discussion is in play, I will be ready.
perfect. Thank you.
Great.
Is there anyone else who would like to speak virtually?
Chair voice, no.
So for Brandon and all of you who are listening, the next item on the agenda is the public hearing for Title 18 Bucket 6 Code updates. So what's going to happen tonight is staff is going to present all 5 topics, and after each topic, the commission will have an opportunity to ask clarifying questions, and then we'll move on to another presentation. After the presentations, after the clarifying questions, then we will open it up for the public hearing, listen to what the public has to say about said presentations. We will close the public hearing and then move on for the commission deliberation. So I believe staff, you are up.
Good evening. Just want to make sure everybody can hear me. I've had some audio issues. If someone can just verify that you can hear me.
Yes, Holly, we can hear you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who is taking time out of their evening to be here to listen to these important topics, and thank you to the commissioners as well. My name is Holly Keaton. I will be presenting a brief explanation of the changes to wireless communication facilities. And go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so what are wireless communication facilities? Wireless communication facilities are any unstaffed facility that transmits or receives radio frequency signals through electromagnetic energy, usually via some sort of cabinet, tower, or other structure that will help it achieve the height needed to receive and transmit radio waves. So some examples of wireless communication facilities include macro cell towers, small cell facilities, and we have some other devices that fall under this category as well. If we can get to the next slide. So I usually find that visual examples are helpful. So here we have a macro cell tower over to the left-hand side, small cell facility in the center top, and then I'm not sure if everybody is aware, but satellite dishes and amateur radio towers are also considered small cell or wireless communication facilities. Okay, so now to talk about the changes that have been made to the wireless code. We didn't make any real substantial changes this go around, as more discussion is needed on some of the topics that we are considering for policy changes. However, we did make some general formatting changes and language changes for clarity of use and transparency. So the first item is the purpose section has been lengthened. So previously, we only had a few items in the purpose section. It now also includes that it assures all providers are in compliance with city rules and standards, minimize visual safety, aesthetic, and environmental impacts, encourage location and co-location on non-municipal structures, and ensure barrier-free equipment is used, provide a comment period, and ensure fair regulatory process. We also made amendments to align with procedural changes, specifically to types of permits and timelines for review, how fees are assessed, and noticing requirements. Additional guidance has been added to the code for making clearer language so that the user of the code, both on the applicant side and the city side, is able to use the code more easily and regulations are more transparent. Code references to FCC timelines have been included. However, the table from the FCC has been taken out. So we are just doing the common practice as we would do with any other type of governmental agency, like we refer to the RCW rather than having the actual table in the code. We're just referring back to the regulation. And then there's just general verbiage changes. For example, regulations has been replaced with standards, and shall has been replaced with must. And those are consistent throughout all of the amendments that you probably already have been hearing about. Again, no substantial changes have been made, mostly language changes, some additional items where more clarity is needed, and simplifying process and making more transparent language. And next slide.
All right,
Are
thank you
there
for the
any questions?
thank you for the presentation. Open it up to the commissioners with their questions. Looking at you, Nina.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Voice. I have a question about changes, and it just pertains to remembering the conversation that we had about locating small wireless facilities on existing poles. And there may not have been a change, but isn't that the conversation we had that was fairly robust about what would be allowed and what wouldn't be allowed? And I'm sorry that I'm just not quite clear on how that was all resolved.
Yes, so in part due to that conversation, we have left the regulations or standards as they were in the previous code, and we have added more discussion to the whiteboard for addressing how we're going to move forward with additional regulations within this code.
Hi, Commissioner Joy Lewis. I'm a little curious about what, how we can help you this evening. I think my biggest question starts out with the background we got that says that these actions don't warrant discussion with the commission, but they're an analysis to help us discuss the policy questions, but there were no policy questions framed to us. So I'm curious if maybe you could help guide us a little bit as to what you're looking for, because you kind of plainly say, we're not really looking for a discussion from the commission. So I'm a little confused as to how we can help tonight, I think is my opening question.
Correct. I think that the goal for having me present this evening was just to clarify that some of those items that have been discussed in the past have not moved forward with these code amendments as they currently are. And the purpose is to ensure that the code aligns with the goals and outcomes chart.
Okay, thank you. I'm curious, on page 9 of 20 of my packet, I'm looking at section .080, applicant notice requirements. It lists 300 feet. Is there a reason why that would be any deviation from the 500 feet that we've been doing elsewhere in Title 18?
So as I mentioned, we didn't change the standards in this code. We just changed some of the language. So that is something that I think would be an item that should be considered.
Okay, great. If you could make a note of that. I'm curious, specifically my questions are really about co-location that we do talk about. Last time, as Nina had mentioned, we had talked about how previously, when carriers came before this very commission, had said that they were not willing to share a pole for co-location. And I'm curious, now there's no language in here that requires them to share the pole, and as previously that was something that we had required and had put through, and so I'm curious, that does seem like a change to me on the co-location. Do we have any?
The language for co-location has remained the same. The language is that it's highly encouraged and preferred, so that hasn't changed.
Encouraged and preferred. So when we're wanting to change our shoulds and our shalls to musts, we decided that preferred was an okay situation for co-location, or where are we at on why we made these choices for co-location language?
You know, I have to pull up the code to look at how it is currently worded versus how it's worded in the amended code.
Yeah, I think that was also kind of some of my questions for like small satellite dish antennas. Is that new language?
It is not.
It is not new language. Thank you. That is very helpful. think my last question about this is on this same section when we talk about, the language talks about, equipment used and not a subjective review of the site, which was selected by a provider. And I'm curious, so when is it? I'm curious about this review process. Again, this is page 9. Right now I'm looking at third-party review. It's .090, section B. And it talks about how, the equipment used is not going to be subjected to review of the site, which was selected by the provider. I'm curious when it will be. When do we expect to be able to, in this process, have review? Does it go before
Okay, I apologize.
director?
You said page
I'm
9.
looking at,
and
my
the
packet is like,
photo-
yeah, 9 of 20, which is specifically for the small cell, and it's 18.512090 third-party review. It says also, it has a note for us, this section is new material to require third-party review, but then it talks about, for me, it's a page flip, but obviously if you're looking digitally, it's not. So I'm curious how, maybe we could explain a little bit more. I'm a little confused about the third-party review part of this.
Sure. So the third-party review was something that was added so that the city has the ability to hire a professional in the field of wireless technology to assist us with large towers that may be applied for within the city.
And this is new language that's being added.
That is new language.
And at what point does it, when is that happen?
That is the director's discretion based on the project.
Okay, thank you. That is exactly the answer that I was looking for. I think that's it right now. I can tell you that my vague question really has to do a little bit about the feet that we use when we start talking about towers at 85 feet, new poles at 30 feet. We start talking about replacement poles are then allowed to be 15 feet in addition to the existing pole. It would be nice to have a little bit of background when we are reviewing this for draft round 2 of talking about really diving into it. I appreciate that in the beginning of the presentation you said it was kind of an overview. The next time we see this, I'd like to have a little bit deeper dive into why we as a community are settling on these particular numbers and how they align to whether it's requirements set on a federal level or whether it's a requirement from the providers in the community or things like that. It would be nice to go through a little bit deeper review on that. So that's all my questions for
Okay,
now, Chair.
so thank you. So those items also have not changed. So what I'm understanding is you want to know why we initially chose those heights when we first put this code together.
Or why we're keeping them, right? So specifically the idea that they would be able to gain an additional 15 foot to that pole. I think, why are we landing on why this is appropriate for us now based on going through it again?
Okay.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Commissioner Bader? All right, well, some of this is technical language that, again, I'm going to defer to some of our experts, but a couple things that did catch my eye was on page 7 of 20, under E, point 2, it says the network provider acknowledges the building permit submittal is an at-risk permit and is dependent upon receiving the land use permit. I'm interested to know, is this practice also used in peer cities? It seems like an enormously expensive way to go.
Legal language to aid the applicant in understanding that they're not necessarily guaranteed a permit just because they go through the permit review process.
Okay. And then I just had one other question. I believe it's page 11 of 20. It's actually in the table, table A. It shows a different column for allowed with conditions. One of them is blocking natural vistas, and that seems kind of extraordinary to me. Who's the arbiter of that? Is that who allows the?
Yeah. So again, it would be a director decision based on the specific application.
Which could have resulting problems for people's property value and depending on the tower and the type.
And that would be with a notice of application as well. So there would be public comment on that.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
I believe that's the questions, so we are ready for the next presentation.
I know, right?
Good evening, commissioners. I think the next up is SEPA. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, Minnie, we can.
Great. One more slide up. Valerie, are you controlling? Are we at the first slide?
Yes, this is the first slide.
Okay, great. So I think hang on. What have we changed in SEPA from the first time we all talked to you? So in the draft that you have in your packets, there were a lot of sections that were updated to reduce redundancies or where there was a conflict between state or federal law. So really very legal kind of clarity and improvement type of changes. Then the biggest change that we want to kind of talk to you about and get your opinion on that we've discussed with you all before is what's exempt from SEPA. So when we first started the conversation with you all, we went over what is SEPA, what is the purpose of SEPA. It's a state law required review and primarily meant to capture things that aren't addressed by code. And if there's mitigation needed for any of the impacts, this is a tool that the cities can use. But it's not really, the purpose isn't to use SEPA to require conditions that are already in our code. And so this is one area for what's exempt from going through SEPA. And based on conversations we had with you all, you suggested what's in it for the city, perhaps requiring sustainable building is an incentive that we would raise our SEPA threshold levels to require something in return, which was sustainable buildings. So number 3 was timelines and estimates had to be updated to be consistent with the state law. Public notice requirements were a little bit not that clear. We've added a section in here that says any project that goes through SEPA requires a public notice early in the process. The state law requires us to give a notice at the time the determination is made, but we have put in language that requires public notice when we deem an application complete, in addition to when an actual determination is made. Next slide, please. We talked about the public notice. So we used to be 300 feet, and based on our conversation with you all in the past, we've increased it to 500 feet, and residents and property owners. There is a little typo in the draft which only references property owners, but our intent is that we will clean that up and reference all our notice procedures in a different chapter where that'll be all consistent, and it'll be 500 feet, property owners and tenants, and publication on the website and other postings and things like that. The next big change really is we had a lot of reference to planning documents over the years. Those have changed. Some new documents have been adopted. So we've cleaned up that list to reference most recent iteration of the documents. The appeal section was a little not very clear. When we make a determination and who do the appeals go to and who hears them and within what time and all that. So we've clarified the appeal section, and the fees are consistent with our fees chapter. So that's the extent of the changes. So we'll get a little bit deeper into the thresholds in the next slide. So a little bit of going down the memory lane of how we landed where we are. Next slide, please. So when we had the initial conversation with you, we shared with you the peer city research, what the state law has as a maximum threshold. So a little refresher on this, our current thresholds, if someone wants to build more than 4 units, has to go through SEPA process. And anyone that wants to build more than 4,000 square feet has to go through a SEPA process. The state law over the years has increased these thresholds multiple times, but where they've landed on this is maximum up to 30 units, single family, 60 units multifamily, and 30,000 square feet of commercial buildings can be exempt from SEPA thresholds. It's not that they have to be, but the state law requires up to that level. The cities cannot choose, buildings over 60,000 don't have to go through SEPA. That's not allowed under the state law. So we had proposed some options back then, perhaps not going all the way up to the maximum, but somewhere in the range of 10 units and 10,000 square feet. Next slide, please. And at the time, we asked these questions to get your policy guidance, no increase, moderate increase, maximum increase. And you all asked us to say, to figure out if there's any incentive that we could get in return. So then we had the discussion, next slide, please, related to the climate action plan and building sustainable buildings conversation. And laid out some policy options for you all. One was anything larger than 10,000 square feet, which roughly equates to 10 to 15 residential units. If someone were to build that size building or that many units, and they were built with a certification from a third party, LEED Gold or Built Green, that they would not have to go through SEPA. So option 2 was 20,000 square feet of commercial building, which roughly equates to 20 to 30 residential units, if they were certified. Some of the advantages of this number 2 were that smaller scale projects, 9 to 10 units, would be, the missing middle type of projects would not have to go through SEPA. And then the third option was 30,000 square feet, which roughly equates to 30 to 45 residential units. I mean, again, these are rough equations, but if you go by 800 square feet per unit or in that range, that's what you get in terms of square footage versus the units. Next slide, please. And so during that conversation with you all, our recommendation at that point was that middle 20,000 square feet. Next slide, please. And here's the discussion. We said, 20,000 square feet, LEED Gold or equivalent, salmon safe if applicable, have some requirement for eco-friendly building materials. So we could exempt buildings up to 20,000 square feet from SEPA as long as they had some sort of certification for being a sustainable building. And then we also wanted to kind of throw in a closer look at affordable housing if there were some other cost-saving measures we needed to look at. So that was our conversation with you all on climate action plan, trading SEPA for getting something in return, or raising the SEPA threshold for some buildings, but getting some or providing some incentive for folks to build sustainable buildings. Next slide, please. So this is what's in your draft. In your draft, it shows the largest possible threshold allowed under the state law. So 30 single-family units, 60 multifamily, and 30,000 square feet for commercial buildings. So what we really need your feedback on, where do we want to land on this incentive for LEED buildings? 4 is our current, 20 is our recommended, 30 is the maximum the state law allows. So our recommendation is 20,000 square feet for commercial buildings and 20 units for a single family or multifamily. Would be the minimum threshold. Above that would need to go through SEPA review, and we would waive the SEPA requirements provided the buildings were LEED certified and Built Green certified. So that's, I think, the last slide. That concludes my presentation.
Great, thank you, Minnie. Any questions from the commission?
I just have a quick clarifying question. So that's only, those higher thresholds are only if the building has some sustainable factor. Otherwise, they would still fall under like the 4 units, or does that apply to everything?
We can do that. We can have our minimum thresholds to not change. We could leave them at 4. Anything 4 is totally exempt. Anything from 4 to 20 is exempt only if it is LEED certified.
Okay, is
So we
that
could
how
have
it's
2
written
tiered.
now? That's how I read
No.
it, I'm not sure.
That how you read the draft code, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
let
see,
me pull
okay.
it up. So the draft code says for single-family projects up to 30 units, that's designed and permitted to fully comply with Built
Yep.
Green and LEED Gold. So there isn't an automatic 4 units.
Okay.
Even 4 units would have to be LEED certified.
Got it.
The way the language is currently in the code.
Okay, thanks.
Good point.
Hey, Minnie, Commissioner Joy Lewis here. So I think to piggyback off of Sarah's question, the draft we have in front of us has the maximum allowable, effectively, option 3 in front of us is written to the code, but you're looking for discussion between kind of option 1, 2, 3, our current, plus these amendments of increasing this evening.
Correct.
Awesome, thank you. And this was my big question, so really thank you for the presentation, really helpful.
Commissioner Milligan.
There it is. Thank you. Nana Milligan here. Didn't know I had to introduce myself again when I'm in person. Yeah, we did. Okay. My question pertains to the exemption through green certification. And did I read correctly that it's green certification plus Salmon Safe? Is that an and? And then does Salmon Safe satisfy the concerns that one of the members of the public wrote to us in email about environmental review?
I think it's up to the Planning and Policy Commission. Yes, we could do it either way. The way I think when we discussed this with you, and this was from feedback from our sustainability manager, Stacy, and us talking through, we were thinking Salmon Safe if applicable. So it's my understanding that that may not be applicable in all situations.
Thank you. I have one more question. This pertains to 18.800.145 about the optional DNS process. And I think I read here that this is this is a continuation of what we had before. And I wanted to hear other words that help explain that what I'm reading is the responsible official has a reasonable basis for determining that significant adverse environmental impacts are unlikely and that they can render a DNS on a project. Does that mean that that project does not have to go through review or be certified or anything? They have the authority, and did they used to have it and we're just keeping it that way?
Yeah, it's not an exemption from SEPA. So optional DNS is really, from an applicant standpoint, what that saves them is there isn't a comment period at the end when a determination is made. You only have an appeal period. If the city makes a determination of non-significance, then there's a 14-day comment period and then a 14 to 21-day appeal period. So that just saves them the time at the end. And it's really meant for projects that it's going to be for sure DNS, and you just tell in your notice of application early. There's some notice requirements earlier required for optional DNS, but we're proposing that we notify all SEPA applications early and get the feedback early in the process.
Hey, Minnie, I'm curious about kind of piggybacking on that, if it's still applicable for preparation section. I'm on page 13 of 20, section A, the preparation of the draft and final EIS and SEIS shall be under the discretion of the responsible official. Is that always done? Are there any situations where that wouldn't be done?
Which section are you reading?
Sorry, so it's gonna be .170, the EIS preparation, section A. I'm on page 13 of 20. I'm curious if there's ever a time where a preparation of draft and the final EIS wouldn't be done. Right now it's saying it's a discretion of the responsible official. The official needs to be satisfied that it complies with this chapter. So I'm curious, when is that done? Is there ever a time where the SEIS isn't done?
Preparation of a draft and final EIS and SEIS. So supplemental environmental impact statement implies that there is already an EIS done, and you're doing a supplement to that. And I think the way this number A is written is preparation of a draft and final, either of those two things, EIS or SEIS, shall be under the direction. So whenever there's an EIS involved, there's going to be a draft and a final done.
There's never a time where there's not, because right now it's saying it's at the discretion of the official. So I guess my question is, when would we not have that?
Will be under the direction of the responsible official. Before the city issues an EIS, the responsible official shall be satisfied that it complies with the chapter. Shall be prepared at the city's option, but, so are you talking A?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not saying at the discretion, it's saying at the direction.
Yes.
So, yeah.
So there's no time where it wouldn't be prepared.
It has to be done. If there's an EIS, you have to prepare a draft and a final. So you get the comments on the draft, and then you issue a final FEIS.
Thank you.
Thank you, commissioners. And then I have two questions. One's a little lighthearted. I'm going to piggyback on Nina. Commissioner Milligan. No, we don't have to say our name at the beginning. So, yeah, just thought I'd help everyone out with that. Now that we're back in chambers to the public, we're kind of getting used to being back in here. So it'll get better as we go along. And then number two, my question for Minnie was, I believe, on page 19 and 20, both under 18, 800, 310, under B1, as well as under C, the city may collect a reasonable fee. Can you help me understand what reasonable is? I guess my hang-up is, if the idea is to provide clarity, reasonable fee kind of comes across as vague. In other areas, we were able to use a percentage so people would understand the cost of the project. Here, it just says reasonable fee. Is that a placeholder?
You will look at it. I think generally when an EIS is done, a lot of times there's a selection of the consultant who's going to do this, and there's usually an RFP that goes out and a cost that comes out of it. And if it's an applicant-driven project, then the entire cost is passed on to the applicant because it's a development project. Other times EISs are done for larger things like whole comprehensive plan updates and things of that nature. So we'll take a look at it. I think we can tighten the language from reasonable to something more specific.
Right, I think somewhere previously in the packet it actually mentions trying to use percentages, so reasonable, I guess what's reasonable to one person is unreasonable to another.
Good point, yeah.
Thank you. Any more clarifying questions as far as the SEPA packet? All right, moving along, next presentation.
I believe that's me. So thank you, Valerie. I am here to talk about forested hillside preservation. I think I've met most of you before. I'm Katie Cody. I'm with BHC Consultants. This is a new chapter that has been written in response to the goal number 1 of the goals and outcomes table to protect forested hillsides. It has also incorporated some existing code. There's some hillside development regulations in the Central Issaquah Urban Design Manual and also in the Talus Design Guidelines. And we're also, this is meant to be taken together with the tree preservation ordinance. So together with the tree preservation and these new design standards, this chapter aims to protect both visual and ecological characteristics of forested hillsides and also non-forested hillsides, especially relating to trees and wall heights. As I mentioned, it adapts some existing design language rather than just being limited to Central and Talus. This would apply citywide to any lots that had a slope above 15% for a sustained vertical rise of 10 feet. So we've chosen the threshold of 15% after discussion with the PPC. We had given some options earlier, 15% or 20%. 15% is the maximum slope that a road grade can be built at. So we took that as a good measuring, as a good threshold for deciding when a slope was considered steep. And then also it goes from 15% up to 40%, and then above 40%, the critical areas regulations apply. So there are some circumstances where a slope could exist that's above 40% and not covered by the critical areas regulations. That would be if it was an engineered slope that's exempt from the steep slope regulations. And in that case, this code would apply to that slope as well. So next slide, please. So a few of the changes, as I mentioned, it's applicable to all the city lots above 15%. We did some mapping as we were preparing this chapter to see where the undeveloped lots were that had slopes above 15%. A lot of the city has some slope, but most of the undeveloped slopes that also had forests on them were located in the outer parts of the city. Very few were located in Old Town and Central, unsurprisingly. But there were some significant, larger parcels in some of the outerlying neighborhoods. We've added a section that is called an alternative compliance option. This acknowledges that the goals that were expressed through the goals and outcomes of protecting forested hillsides also mentioned limiting retaining walls and retaining wall heights. It's hard to achieve both of those goals simultaneously sometimes, because as you create shorter walls, many shorter walls to terrace up a hillside, that requires more removal of trees. You can preserve more trees by making a taller wall and cutting less deep into the hillside. So we wanted to acknowledge that some of these goals that we're expressing through this Forested Hillsides chapter can be conflicting, and to provide a flexible option for developments that are seeking, for example, to preserve an intact forest. Perhaps that would be a circumstance where a slightly taller wall or a deeper cut would be acceptable. And then other than that, in general, this chapter includes development standards for buildings themselves and how they can blend into the surrounding hillsides, for roads, how to create roads that mimic the hillside topography, also for subdivisions, looking into ways that we can site lots to also curve around the hillside rather than cutting into them, to try to minimize the grading required and to preserve as many trees as possible. Next slide, please. So these are kind of small, but we wanted to show some of the graphics that we created for this chapter. The top graphic shows this idea of this alternative compliance option, where you have an existing slope with trees. You can disturb a small area and preserve the uphill trees. Those are the top two. And then the bottom, as an alternative, if you wanted to prioritize having shorter terraced walls, you would achieve that, but you would end up removing more trees. And then that bottom right-hand option is showing a deeper cut along the street to, again, preserve upheld trees. And then some of these other graphics are showing different ways to develop along streets that mimic natural topographies more and minimize tall walls along the street as much as possible. So that's all I have for my presentation, but we don't have any policy discussion questions, but I am here to answer your general questions.
Any questions?
I have a question about the allowed exemptions for this chapter, and I'm curious if you can tell us more about what is going to be the allowed criteria for the variance. There's not a lot of language in here that talks about it. How, requesting a variance from the natural contouring and cuts. Again, this is page 16 of 18 if you're following. Section .110 for allowed exceptions to this chapter. B1 where it starts to talk about the fill and cut limits. There's not a lot of language that talks about what the allowed criteria are that makes it pretty plain. Is this something we're expecting to see in the next draft? Or is this one of our favorite director discretion?
This actually is not director discretion. The alternative compliance has criteria, but that would be more of a director discretion. What this is saying is if you can't meet your cut and fill limits, you have to get a variance, and a variance is not a director discretion. It's a discretionary approval from the Development Commission, I believe, or hearing examiner, but that these are some specific situations where you may have some additional support in certain circumstances for that variance. So this wouldn't be so this is
a site per site, and it's going to go to DC. Is that how I'm supposed to be understanding this?
I'm not 100% sure who the variance decision maker is. I think that it's the hearing examiner, but maybe Minnie knows off the top of her head. But this is not intended to be a director decision.
Yeah, the general variance decision is a level 3 under the proposed draft, which you all will see in the next meeting, and that is a hearing examiner decision with a public hearing and notice.
Thank you, Minnie.
Thank you for this presentation, Katie. The question I have has to do with examples of residential building on hillsides that are not demonstrated in these models. And I don't know if I'll be able to describe these very well, but I'll try. These are with a cut into the hillside, and then there are others that just barely anchor to the hillside and then go out from the hillside with supports and pillars and things that kind of cantilever a home over a hillside. I don't know how that is managed here. Does maximum height on that average grading help manage those sort of building circumstances?
So we're not allowing averaging of height. They would be, so I think that the first way I'd answer this is most of those conditions where a house is perched on the edge of a hillside, those are usually slopes that are above 40%. And so I think that there may be very few circumstances where you would find, maybe a slope with 39%, and then that could come into play here. But where you have that condition of even building a house into a hillside in order to get a true, daylit basement and upper floor, that kind of step down, that needs an angle of 40% or so, just the way that the heights work out. I'm not an architect, but we did talk with an architect when we were putting this together. So we've sort of been thinking through these things. I think if a home wanted to build without digging into the site on pillars on this slope that was not 40%, this wouldn't necessarily prevent that, but they would have to meet, the height limits. And again, I just don't know if the slope if that would make sense architecturally. But again, I'm not making any promises. So to answer your question about the average slope, we're not allowing slopes to be average. So their height would be, average height. Their height would be measured. I'm just scrolling down to try to get to that picture. Bear with me here. So it would be a parallel line from the slope upward, so that their tallest part of the building would be or the tallest allowed area would be at the bottom of the slope. And so it wouldn't really benefit them to stick it out from the hillside, because you're right, they would run up against that.
Okay, good. And I have just one more little question. I can't remember where it is, but there was a thing about decks must be terraced. And it was just a little, okay. It didn't seem to have enough guidance in that, the why or what would you achieve if you terraced and so what kind of terracing and how much?
Sure.
Is there any other guidance somewhere else about that?
I think that's envisioning, rather than having a deck that's maybe at the top of the house and has long support poles, that it would be located closer to the ground, and then another portion that was disconnected would be located at a lower level, rather than having one that stretched the whole width of the house. So that's what that was trying to achieve.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions? Not so many questions, I have some comments. But yeah, I guess I'll have to wait. So we are moving on to our next presentation. I believe this is presentation 4.
All right, hello, my name is Valerie Porter. I'm going to be talking about the last 2 sections. So first we're going to talk about accessory and temporary uses. So what are they? This chapter talks about 3 different topics. The first one is accessory structures. This section regulates subordinate uses that are structures subordinate to the principal structures. Some examples of this are like decks, patio, sheds, heliports. The next topic is temporary structures or uses. And this section regulates uses or structures that are on a temporary basis, so that could occur 1 day or 180 days. Some examples of this is food trucks, pop-up stands, and construction trailers. And the last topic that's addressed in this section is sustainable micro-infrastructure. And this regulates alternative energy and rainwater catchment systems. And examples of this is wind turbines, geothermal heat pumps, and rainwater harvesting tanks. So some of the main major changes that occurred in this section is we removed the heliport standards, basically because this is heavily regulated by the FAA, and we felt that it wasn't necessary to duplicate it in the code. Another change was to modify the temporary retail sales standards. We did this because we tried to provide some kind of clarity and for the applicants so that they understood where these uses could occur and when they are allowed. We also modified the sustainable micro infrastructure text. Basically, we just did a lot of consolidating, tried to remove any duplicates. And in some cases, we tried to integrate should and consider. In other cases, we replaced shall with must. We tried to do this to provide clarity as to guidance versus enforcement. There we go. So we've actually changed a couple of the policy questions that are in your packet. But before I get into the questions, I just kind of want to give a brief discussion on food trucks because that's what the policy question is on. So today, if someone wanted to apply for a food truck to operate in the city of Issaquah, they would be required to obtain a business license, and they submit their application through the state's website, and then the state routes it to the city, which we then review for compliance, and then we would approve it. These business licenses are good for about 1 year, and the applicant has the ability to renew it after that year. The food truck is also required to get any additional permits like King County health permits, and they would also be required to have an agreement with the property owner that they wish to reside on. So in this whole process, the only permit that the city looks at would be the business license. So also in the new code, we've updated the permitted use table. So now that it's clear, we have food trucks listed, and they're only allowed in commercial zones, not residential. So the first question that we're going to pose is, should food trucks operating on private property be term limited? If so, how long? Right now in the draft code, we have 60 days. And the second question is, in addition to a business license, should a separate permit be required for food trucks operating on private property? And the second permit would allow staff to kind of track how many food trucks that we have in the city, and then also allow us to confirm if there's any on-site issues with the principal business. So that concludes my first presentation.
Great, thank you, Valerie. And she was clever there because she tried to sneak in policy questions. That's really for our deliberations, because we still need to hear from Brandon and other people from the public, so very clever. First, we'd like to do some clarifying questions. Does anyone have any questions as far as the packet is concerned or Valerie's presentation? Almost. So just to kick it off, since my microphone's on page 2 of 12, Valerie, this is under 18508.30 accessory structures. C3, point A. It says must be located a minimum of 6 feet from the principal structure. 6 feet seems pretty prescriptive. Well, I mean, that's like somebody's wingspan. That's pretty close. So where do we get that number, and why do we have that number?
I'm not sure where that number comes from. I would have to look into that. But I do know that this is currently in the existing code, so this is a carryover.
Okay.
Yeah, if I may, Valerie, add to that. A lot of times 5 or 6 feet is a minimum fire code requirement as well for, it's regardless of the food truck, but it's any structure without having a firewall and a different type of a construction, that's usually the minimum distance for fire code related issues. It's possible that we put it in code related to that issue.
I'm going to jump in because I had the same question. And my question, when I wrote my note, I was saying, is this an issue that code is trying to fix? And if so, often like things like propane, I think the fire department actually has like 10 feet. It's supposed to, like, the propane tanks are supposed to be 10 feet from a structure. So then I was like, where did the 6 come from? So I might just make that as since we both had questions about it, it might be worth going back and just clarifying, this is our number and this is why it would be helpful to say. Because I'm positive it's for a reason, right? So I just wanted to know where that reason fell.
Yeah, definitely. We'll take a look at it and confirm what fire, building, try not to duplicate.
Right, 6 feet seems pretty narrow. Do you have another question?
I'm going to go ahead, Valerie, with another question on D, the decks, porches, patios. On 2A, is this addressing an overhang but not a porch? Is that what I'm supposed to be understanding? An overhang, like an awning or some sort of, but is...
Do you mind?
Sorry, page 3 of 12, I'm looking at, so this is .030, section D, decks, porches, patios, walkways, and other minor accessory structures. 2A, a structure with a height of 30 inches or more above finished grade may extend into a side or rear setback up to 20% of the required linear distance, but no closer than 5 feet from any property line as shown, right?
Yes.
So are we talking about overhangs but not porches, or is that supposed to be a porch? Because it would be a pretty small little porch if we're talking about 20%, so.
Yes, that would be like decks or, yeah.
Awnings, like, is that what
Yes.
it's supposed to be more?
Correct.
Okay, so we don't have something separate for a decking structure.
No, this would cover
This is all
decks.
for the same, right?
Yes,
Awnings,
correct.
okay. So is there any need, so for, we're talking about the sprawl that may happen as far as, we have later places in the code where we talk about, requires the vendors for refuse containers and things like that. You know, we have that sprawl that will end up happening outside of the individual unit. Let's say tables, chairs, things that come along with it. Is there any requirements right now of where those are supposed to be located, or any language about?
Not for chairs and
It just
tables
has to
and-
be attached to the structure to have to be aligning to these measurements, right?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Joy, for the leverage. My question regards why this may be a carryover from previous, and it just seemed odd that anything was allowed within 3 feet of the property line. But so I can see that this has to do with the perception from the property, adjacent property. But I wonder, was this reviewed to make a more consistent standard that all decks need to be 5 feet away from an adjacent property? Just kind of wondered how the process was when looking at this.
This is another carryover standard from the existing code, so we can look at why the 5 feet, the 5 feet requirement, maybe Minnie knows, but I would guess it maybe has to do with building.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. I think another approach is to just defer to the setbacks of the underlying zone rather than try and have these, hardwired numbers that we don't know where they came from. So one option may be to just defer to the underlying zoning and form and intensity setbacks that we have.
I had actually, I have to apologize. I meant to email staff about this. On section 8, page 8 of 12, I did not, by the way, so this is, but when we're talking about D3, insurance, the following amounts of coverage are required, but there's no amounts. Is that because it just wasn't a copy and paste, or are we planning on still refining? It's talking about the co-insurance, you have to put the city on your co-insurance.
Yeah, I believe there is an amount, I just don't think we have it listed. Do you know off the top of your? Yeah, I would have to
Okay.
get back to you on the amounts, but
Thank
there's
you.
a specific limit.
And when we do talk about section 4 for refuse, including compost, and encouraged to provide recycling, we don't. That was a new thing for me. We don't require recycling right now.
There is an ordinance where you're supposed to provide all 3 streams, but I don't think it's codified, so
Okay.
this would be something new.
And I do have, since I have my microphone on, I'll keep going with my next one, which is same page 9 of 12, section F2, where we start talking about outdoor retail display, except for seasonal vendings, which are limited to Christmas tree stands and produce stands. I had a big red flag that popped up for me, and I was curious why we had that language. It's not terribly inclusive, and I think we all know that holidays are a lot more extensive than the need for a Christmas tree stand or a produce stand. There's a lot of different variety of things. And so that language, I'm curious, why, is that a port over? Why, maybe you could, city discussion about why we settled on those pretty limited uses.
I believe this is another carryover from the previous code. It looks like it's just not allowed in the CBD zone.
Yeah.
So anywhere else it would be allowed. Yeah, I'm not quite sure. We would have to look into that.
Okay, thank you, Valerie.
Any further questions on this topic?
Yeah, I have a question. Apologies, I'm like fighting with the scrolling on here, so I can't find like the numbers all together, but it's about the kind of non-accessory temporary retail. I think it's in that section. It was a little confusing to me. I think this applies to the food trucks, but it's saying that, I think there's two different sections. One where if it's located in a parking lot where there's not like a permanent commercial structure or something like that, then they require a circulation plan that requires approval. There's also language in there that says like if it applies if it's there for more than 1 hour or from 1 day to 60 days. And so just reading through it, it really wasn't clear to me. Because when I think of like a lot of these uses, right, they're usually there for more than an hour, but not more than a day. And
Right.
so I just wasn't sure what the actual like threshold was for requiring that.
Well, that's kind of part of the discussion tonight, is that we kind of want to get your guys' feedback
Okay.
and get some direction. We put some stuff in place just to kind of generate discussion, but it could always be changed.
I think those are called Easter eggs, right? All right. Any further questions? All right, Valerie, take us home. Number 5.
All right, the last topic is through-walk passages. So this topic actually is going to be relocated to the street standards, but before we do that, we wanted to get your feedback on some of this. So what are through-walk passages? They are privately owned walkways that are accessible to the general public. They are intended to provide access to open spaces and buildings, also try to reduce block sizes by providing street connections, and also act as gathering spaces. So some of the changes that occurred in the draft code is that we tried to consolidate some of the regulations. Right now, there's through-walk passage sections in the Central Issaquah Development Design Standards, and there's also some in the design manual. So just to try to ensure that there's no conflicts and so people know where to look, we consolidated those in one location. We also created a map to help applicants understand exactly where the desired location for these through-walk passages are. We also tried to add language requiring the through-walk passage have public access easement. This ensures that the pathways can be used by the general public 24/7. And we tried to add specific design requirements for residential and commercial uses. So right now, we just say that there are through-block passages. In some instances, you should apply them. So we really tried to be very specific about when they're required in what circumstances. And then we also tried to really redesign the layout so that they were more feasible. So for instance, like we increased the bed widths so to ensure that trees can properly grow. And then for some of the through-walk passages that are required in the design manual, we disallowed vehicles to try to increase the pedestrian safety. And then we also reduced some of the paths to try to increase the likelihood of construction. And the last change is that we've tried to establish some expectations of when a through-walk passage can deviate from code. Right now, you know, again, we say that a through-walk passage is required, but we don't say, you know, in what instances does it not make sense? These are the things that you must do, or we don't have any design criteria. So we try to limit the deviation request and then also provide some clear expectations when you can request a deviation. So I have a policy question. So the city anticipates creating individual neighborhood plans for the future for these areas outside of Central Issaquah, because we've already identified where we would like the through-walk passages in Central Issaquah. Should the code require through-walk passages to be constructed with the development of subdivisions only and or identify specific through-walk passage locations through the neighborhood planning process, which would be implemented during the redevelopment stage? So this is the only question, and now we'll take questions.
Any clarifying questions for through-block passages?
I'll ask a question. The question pertains to the likelihood of something getting built and so reducing the requirement so it could be likely to be built and then adding the opportunity to apply for a deviation. Seems like there's a lot of balancing there that isn't strengthening the high value that we place on the through block passages. How did you feel about the balance between requiring and the deviations when you were working on this?
I thought about a couple of projects. So right now, how we have it is that if you have, like, say, a residential project and you want to do like townhomes, and not all the townhomes are able to front the main street, you would be required to do a through block passage. We understand that, you know, some of the lots, especially in central Issaquah, are very narrow. So to, you know, get a, you know, townhomes, your driveway, through block passage, it really, you're packing a lot into a small space. And so when thinking about those type scenarios, that's how we tried to determine the expectations, and then also trying to work through some of the problems that we've had in the past. So we do think that with these new standards, this will kind of ensure that, you know, a through block passage gets constructed, and then it's in a standard that is, you know, that works for the city and the developer. Because there's a lot of times where folks come in to develop, and then they know that they learn that they have to do these through block passages, and the project doesn't go forward because the through block passage is so large.
And then one more question was, I went really quickly through this packet, so pardon me if it's right in front of my face. Where is the standard by which a block is long enough to require a through block passage?
It's, I believe, in a couple locations. So we have the map. I will say that the map is more of a visual aid. It doesn't show the entire central Issaquah area. So we plan on updating that for the next draft. Let me quickly. I can't find it very quickly, but I know it's here. But again, we would be relying on the map as well.
So, but the map is only of central Issaquah?
Yes.
So there isn't a map defining where the through block passages are for the rest of the city?
Correct, which is part of the policy question.
Yeah, right, thank you.
Valerie, I'm curious, so when the development is being planned, the through block passages are supposed to be separate from fire access, correct? There would already be a street with fire access?
Correct.
So through block passages would then be able to effectively be completely inappropriate for a vehicle the way they were designed?
Correct. They have to be separate from vehicles.
And so, they have to be, but there isn't an availability of a developer to be able to use them for emergency vehicles or things like that?
In the current code, we do have some paths that allow for emergency vehicles or utilities, but how this, what we're proposing, no, you could not have vehicles. They have to be separate.
Thank you.
All right, I think I have a couple questions for you, Valerie. On page 1 of 6, 18.702.20, applicability, A and B. If it is required everywhere throughout the city for redevelopment and new development, why is there a distinction in Part B in Central Issaquah? Is that because the policy question you guys are asking what we're doing outside of Central? Okay.
Correct.
So that was one, thank you. Page 5 of 6, 18.70, no, the only one there, .50, through block passage, design standards. A1, residential land uses. The through block passage is required when providing access to 7 or more entryways that do not directly gain access from a transportation facility. I think I asked this last time. What is the definition of a transportation facility?
We know you've been asking for the definitions, and you're gonna have to wait 1 or 2 more weeks.
Okay.
But basically the transportation facility is the main street.
Okay. And I think that is it for me. Any final questions for Valerie as far as clarifying questions? All right. Well, thank you, Valerie. Great job. And I believe that's it. So here we are at the public hearing, which I know our wonderful public has been waiting for the opportunity to have their voices heard. So we're going to open up tonight's public comment portion of the public hearing at 7:52 p.m. And what I'm going to ask staff now, has anyone present signed up to speak? And if so, please come to the podium and state your name before making your comments.
Yes, Chair, we have one presenter, Brandon Salmary.
Oh, I got it. Yeah, this is my first time being part of the council, so thanks for hearing me out. My questions are all directed towards Valerie over here, and your questions about the code or the new code for food trucks. One of my key questions, when you're referring to food trucks being on private property, is that when they're doing retail service, or is that when they're just parked for storage? I never got a pamphlet. I mean, I saw you guys all flipping through Title 18, but I just was emailed this about two days ago and decided to, take some time out of my day to come down and go over this.
And we do appreciate it so much. You would have liked to probably hear this sooner, Brandon, but this is not a Q&A, so staff can actually not respond to your questions right now, nor us. This is for you. Basically, imagine a courtroom, right? So you're providing evidence for us to hear and take into account.
Perfect. All right. Well, then let's take a few things into account. When the pandemic first came out, food trucks really lost all their places to go because every business, every corporation shut down, and our normal, places we would serve were no longer available for us to go. So we had to scramble and find places to go. I sat down with me and my team. I have a couple food trucks in town, and we thought, where are the people? And we decided that they're all in their neighborhoods. So we, without any knowledge of what the laws were, the RCW codes were, what your municipal codes are, decided to start going into these neighborhoods. I took it upon myself to reach out to the city of Issaquah and find out what the policies were on food trucks parking in right-of-ways. I know that the RCW codes and that the codes of the Washington Health Department allow for food trucks to park in most right-of-ways for up to 4 hours without a bathroom agreement. Now, that is just Health Department. So we decided to start going into neighborhoods where I had friends and family. One of them was over here in Muirwood Park, which is South Cove area. Another one was up in the Issaquah Highlands by the Central Park area. There was another one in Miramont and a handful of other ones. I actually talked to a few people on the phone, but it seemed like everything was in disarray. I would talk to one person, I talked to another person, then I talked to another person after that. Nobody was communicating with one another. So we just decided to start going and created a website that was helpful for other food trucks, basically telling you, hey, here's where we're going. Whether we're breaking the law or not, we just did not care. Most people followed suit, and they wound up emailing me, hey, who's your contact? Well, what happened was community leaders in these neighborhoods decided to start getting together and reaching out to me to contact these food trucks, and they were the ones reaching out to the people in that community, and it was a hit. Everybody loved it. We all followed the rules and regulations of the COVID protocol, fucking 6 feet away, wear your mask, wash your hands, all the stuff. We were the smallest of businesses compared to most retail businesses and most of the businesses right here on Front Street that are a restaurant. And we tried to survive our best. A lot of my friends actually lost their business, and a lot of them actually gained more business due to what we were doing. So when I'm hearing new codes coming about right-of-ways and 7 days, being allowed to park in a right-of-way, that kind of strikes me as more of just people parking their food truck in a right-of-way, which I get that. Nobody wants to see a food truck parked in a right-of-way just being stored there. But when it comes to private parking, just storage, I park them at my house. And I don't want the city coming up to me telling me, hey, you can't have these cars parked here. We're not doing retail out of there, not selling out of there. So when I hear the presentation that Valerie just gave, which is why I asked my question that cannot be answered, very strange, but I get it, decorum. That's my concern. I don't want to have anyone tell me I can't do what I want to do with my private property. Now, going back to
my idea about having food trucks being parked in right-of-ways, serving at parks in certain communities. I think the city could benefit greatly if they did paint off an area that said food truck only. Anybody who wanted to go and serve in that area could reach out to the city. Then this is just off the top of my head. Reach out to the city and say, hey, let me give you guys $35 for the day. I'll park my truck there and we'll serve for that day, and we now have that spot. The city could benefit greatly from that because they can get an income. The reason I say $35 is because every other website that I work with, and I've been working with them for 12 years, if you go to a business park, it's $35. Sometimes it's 70, sometimes it's 100, sometimes it's 10%. Just what it is. But a city doing it would be unique. Not a lot of cities do it. And if the city wants to bring in an income on what food trucks are already doing, most of the food trucks would hail that. They would love it. They would think that a $35, city granted spot that you can reserve with the city would be excellent. And like I've listed, there are 5 spots that we were going to that were all really good spots. So I guess that's my input on the right-of-way. And my input on the private property, you should just kind of let us do what we want to do. The guy over here on the end of the lot that owns the gas station, there's a food truck park right there. He's been there, I think, for 2 years now. 4 years. Was that you? No. Okay. Well, he's been there 4 years. Must be a friend. I know him. No, well, okay. So he's been there 4 years. If you guys, excuse me, if you implement a 60-day food truck at this private location, that can cause a lot of problems. Is that going to be 60 days for that particular food truck? And then you can move another one in there for 60 days? Why is the city going to get involved in what happens on public property? I already know the man pays $4,000 a month to stay on that private property, and he serves to the public, and there's no problems. Another problem with putting a 60-day period on parking at this spot is that 60 days for the year, or is that 60 days for 10 years? What happens if he moves for 1 day and then he goes back into that spot? Now you got to restart the 60 days, correct? So there's a lot of.
So 5 minutes is up. Could you wrap up at public?
Oh, yeah, I'm done.
Okay, thank you.
You guys heard me. I made sense. We're all good. Have a good day.
All right. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak virtually?
Chair Voice, we have one person signed up virtually to speak public comment.
Okay.
Mr. Ramsey, I'm going to make you a panelist now and unmute you.
Great, thank you. I'm hoping everybody can hear me. Is that correct?
Yes, we can.
My name's Tom Ramsey. I own Tuscan Stone Pizza. We're located on East Lake Sammamish Boulevard in front of the Value Village. We've been there for over 5 years. Have a great customer base in Issaquah, over 1,000 customers. Really want to stay in Issaquah. We enjoy being there and being part of the community. We comply with all the business regulations, a business license, pay taxes, comply with health requirements. So we're very interested in what the city is going to do. We hope that there's a way that our business, which has been existing, we're not mobile, although we are a food trailer, but we don't move around. We're permanently located. That's our business model. We have 4 locations across the east side, and would hope that we can stay in Issaquah and that the Planning Commission and the City Council consider us, and we try to participate and be a good citizen. So we hope that that'll be taken into account as you move ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Valerie, I believe we had one more in-person speech that came in late.
Thank Thank you. You guys can hear me well over here. Thank you so much. My name is Hugo Barraza, and I'm here on behalf of my food truck as well, who I just recently started about 2 weeks ago in the city of Issaquah. Thank you for hearing me out. Commissioners, Chair, Valerie, I'm speaking to you right now. You know, it was very sad for me to get that email with that code where it says I'm gonna be limited to be here for 60 days when I was planning to be here for the long run, you know, years to come. There's 4 food trucks that I'm aware, plus a trailer that the sir just mentioned. They are fully permanent here in the city of Issaquah. And it will be a huge impact. Like for me, especially right now, because I'm starting, but for all of them as well, because I guess every food truck's dream is to start a restaurant in a location where we were hoping to have a small place at least here in Front Street, right? But we can't afford it. It's, you know, starting a food truck is about, you know, you name it, $100,000 inversion. But it can go higher or it can go lower. A restaurant, I just can't afford to just go in a lease, you know. And you mentioned the city only requests the license, but for us to operate, we definitely provide more than that. You know, we have to go to LNI certifications, definitely fire department, health department, state secretary, the state of Washington, the city of Issaquah, the IRS, many other things to be able to operate 100%. And I don't know how is it gonna be in the future for this code, but this pass, if this is as is right now, you know, I don't see another reason why somebody else on private property just won't get shut down on everything else. You know, what about, you know, any other people who sells other type of food, like animals food? There's storage, their food in, you know, in their private properties. What about that? Is the city gonna come in and shut that down too for 60 days? You know, the other person who was here just mentioned the other part of, you know, being just park, private property and all this. He mentioned a lot of the stuff I wanted to mention. I think you guys can kind of have an idea of what it is. Moving around, you know, requesting locations. I wanted to be here permanently and I wanted to grow in the city of Issaquah, but right now I'm here, you know, really sad because it's not easy to be where I am right now, 2 weeks started. And now I'm just like, oh, so am I supposed to get ready to go? Because I'm not gonna stay here for 60 days. I wanted to be here for years to come. And I'm sure we can work it out. I'm sure there's many other ways the city can, you know, complement a way we can work it out. There's many other cities that allow food trucks to operate in many other ways, you know. Wish we can have a land where we can all park together, you know, and just have a community with so many different type of foods. You know, I'm proud to be here because out of those 1 or 5 food trucks that were here in the city of Issaquah that I'm aware of, 4 of them are Mexican food trucks, but they're all very different. You know, Sachi, which is, I love it. It's a place that I've been there for a long time. She's from Mexico City. Hopefully she's hearing me out. They have great food, you know, and they've been there for years. So now that they have to go, they don't even have a motor engine to move. They have a trailer. It's a tough thing for them to move. So I don't know what's gonna happen to them. They are inside a private property. You know, Last is different type of food, a little bit here and there, but really good food. Armored, like north side of Mexico type of a food, and we can continue going on and on and on because Mexico has way varieties of type of foods, depends where the states you are. And we're here proud and, you know, trying to see if the city will take it in a good way, because I might not be listening to myself really nice right now. But this is just comes from me because I'm really sad. It just, it really got me this time really bad. But I'm not.
Excuse me, sir. So the 5 minutes have come up. Could you?
Absolutely. Just appreciate it for you guys to letting me be here and the invitation. And nice to meet you guys. I'm Hugo from North Baja, and I'm located at the Grange, private property. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo, and I will take responsibility for not properly letting everybody know there is a 5-minute time limit on public comment. So again, I apologize to the last few speakers. That was my fault, so that was not clear. But just in time for the last speaker. So, Mr. Karam, please.
Thank you, sir. I really start to like it here. I can't get away from this podium. But anyhow, my name is Hossein Karam. I'm a local developer, and I learned a lot today. It was just kind of interesting. Before I got into the development, I worked for the Boeing company, a mechanical engineer. We did work on fire, life, and safety issues. And one of the things that kind of struck me was this through block access. Now, my site has some of the things in it, but we're kind of lucky the length works out. But fire department has a rule called 150-foot rule, which their hose is 150 feet. So any portion of the building should be within reach of that 150 feet for fire, life, and safety in the case of fire. Now, the through block that I have is pretty good size. It's 10 feet, another 5 feet next to it, 15 feet. God forbid, if it's a fire, I know what the fire truck is going to do. It's going to pull right in and just go right there to save lives. If you are going to make it narrower or close it off to fire, life, and emergency, even on emergency basis, you could be endangering people's lives. So haven't read the draft agreements. I just want to make sure that you always got to think we want to save lives in the case of an emergency. And when you have a narrow lot, narrow and long, you got to have access maybe on one side in the building. And if you have to put another through block that is narrow and is closed off to even emergency traffic, if something goes sideways, it could cause death and loss of life. So just want to bring it up. I'm here. I thought I could do a little bit of help. Why not? Thanks for having me.
All right. Valerie, Stephen, do we have any other people that would like to speak?
Chair Voice, I don't see any other hands virtually.
All right. We will close the public hearing for this evening at 8:10 p.m. Usually I'd say something like it's fight night, but we're all friends, so it's deliberation time. So definitely not fight night. We are going to take this apart one by one, and I believe we probably just want to go in the order that it was presented. Yes, and we are going to take a 5-minute respite. So we will be back in 5. All right, well, thank you very much. We are now going to begin the deliberation portion for the planning policy, where we're going to basically go through this, and we're going to take it from the top, just the way that it was presented to us by staff, and we'll begin with the wireless communication facilities. Commissioners, any comments about the wireless communication facilities?
I'll break the ice here. Thank you, I don't know if she's there anymore, for the presentation. And I appreciate the whiteboard and look forward to those discussions, because that was quite a complicated discussion about pole location. My only comment for going forward was to just make an edit to how this was presented, in that nothing changed. Okay, that's fine, but as I read this, it said that there were 3 sections that were new and added, which I consider a change. So if, as we go forward in presenting it, to be a little more clear, I would say that although we didn't change regulation, we added 3 sections, and they are 090, 080, and 140. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Lewis.
When going through this, I had a tougher time with this section of bucket 6. I have the benefit of having had this discussion several times before, and what I will say about this is that I don't think that it serves us very well. I think we ported over some language, and I think what this ends up doing is leaving us highly unregulated and somewhat vulnerable. And I think that what we could use is some while still being able to say, here are policy discussions we want to have for the future, being able to tighten some of this up. You know, we talked about before about view corridor. You know, we specifically say about the intent, and I would like to have language. It says we on point 8, we want to ensure that equipment does not become a barrier or impediment to pedestrians and bicyclists, but also view corridors and wildlife. I think that there are other key things that are missing in language right now. I think also, when we talk about small cell, that we need to actually have in our language that a carrier needs to show a net effect and benefit, rather than necessarily what is the community getting from this. I think also when we talk about some of the images that we have here, it would be nice to have some scale, right? We have like a picture of a tower with kind of like some wispy bushes, right? But it's hard for, I think, a community to really recognize how big some of this equipment is, and so it might be nice to update that with a little bit of a scale of our little person, for instance, might be a good idea. So I would like us to be able to look at this section for draft number 2 with a little bit of a more critical eye, by being able to parse out, these are the things we'd like to put on the whiteboard. These are the things that we want to address because we're trying to tighten up, consolidate our code. We want to be streamlining it, but we also want to not be making effectively big holes, right, that we need to then plug later on down the line, and that's what I see in this section in a way. So I would look forward to having some language added, maybe, rather than necessarily ported over, that gets us to where we want to go next with the code. Thank you.
Thank you, and then a couple comments from me. I'm going to go back to that chart first on page 11 of 20, allowed with conditions, blocking natural vistas. This is obviously concerning because this would affect people's property values. I understand eminent domain. I understand that there's particular areas that the providers want to place their towers for different reasons. I'd like to look at that if there's a remedy for blocking natural vistas, because again, you're talking about somebody's property value. I'm thinking of that large tower north of I-90 as you're coming from basically past the Sammamish exit to the 900 exit. Right, what's 900? Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, like a tower like that, you know, if that was to be placed in front of particular houses, that could diminish the property value. And then also on page 19 of 20, 18.512.150 interference, I thought point C was good. In the event of the interference with city facilities cannot be eliminated or remediated to the satisfaction of the designated official, there he is again, the network provider must shut down and remove all facilities determined to cause interference at network provider's sole expense. I thought that's great. So that's good. And then down below, where are we? 18.5.12.140 Part D. This one's hard because, you know, it has to deal with graffiti. It says within 14 days. You know, I don't really understand how graffiti is cleaned from the city, but 14 days, then spray painted again. I don't know if 14 days. I'm not sure if that's taken from a different part of code, if that's taken from what other cities have. Little concerned about 14 days.
Well, I think to your point, there was also mention about non-graffiti paint that was supposed to be put up. Is that also in this section? Or was that, I feel like this was here where it was like supposed to be, but we as a community have really enjoyed having any kind of equipment actually being painted by artists where they blend into the environment and things like that. So there's no language right now here that talks about involving the Arts Commission for particular, you know, eyesores within the community. I think there's a lot that could be whiteboarded about this. We've had other discussions too about how other communities have a fee structure that allow for when things are on private property where citizens are able to collect a fee, and these carriers are required to pay to be able to use rather than saying we have eminent domain because we're providing a service. We've talked to about Wi-Fi for public areas and things like that to be able to give a trade-off and a benefit to the community. So I think there's a lot of things that need to be whiteboarded, and to your point about graffiti is a good point about how we interact in our space.
The famous whiteboard. So Joy, I mean, I just, when you said non-graffiti paint, I mean, I thought that was like $1 million idea, and then I realized what you were saying, there's no such thing as non-graffiti paint. But to your point, I did read something about kind of like vinyl wrapping certain facility boxes. I don't know if there's a particular, you do that maybe 10 foot up a pole to the point where people would need a ladder. Like I said, that was something that caught my eye, is the graffiti problem. Unfortunately, we don't have one, but neither did Seattle about 10 years ago, so concerning. All right, anyone else have anything they'd like to add as far as the wireless communicate, please?
Thank you. Just wanted to plus one to both of you in that deliberative spirit. Thank you for the comments that you make and for the way that Commissioner Lewis took my comment about, I'm so glad about the whiteboard, when really that was a pretty softball pitch from me, and then Joy made it come home in that, yeah, there are things in the whiteboard that if we do not address those sooner rather than later, they will create a gaping hole in what was really important to us. And so I would rather than just say, oh, thank goodness it's on the whiteboard, which is the way I was feeling. I was glad to hear Commissioner Lewis really express deeply what we're trying to do, and that there may be some things on the whiteboard about pole location and all those kinds of things that need stricter standards sooner, because it's going to take us a while to get to that whiteboard. It's pretty full. So I don't know how we're going to prioritize the whiteboard in time for any things that must get in this year. Maybe you all could comment on the process for that.
For those of us not in the room, that was an excellent look from Valerie. Just to note, and I think the small cell needs to urgently be addressed in a way that is not being addressed right now in this packet. It's here, it's coming, and it can be a solution when done correctly. But because of our terrain and forested hillsides, as we all know, you go through a tree canopy and your call is dropped. And so how, does small cell actually service the community in these situations, or are we just adding more and more frequency to our community without actually having a gain? So there are things that need to be fine-tuned, where the administration comes to us and said, this is our stance, this is what we want to see, is that we have a direction that we can actually debate a little bit for this.
All right, well, thank you. We're going to move along to SEPA, the environmental policy. So, because I'm the outlier, I will go first. What's interesting is we had two public comments come in, I believe either today or yesterday. One who thought the rules should be weakened, one who thought the rules should be strengthened. I'm kind of I would like to see us raise it to the maximum threshold. I know I'm the outlier. I'm really not even interested in the trade-off with the lead. What I'd like to see, I think the trade-off is more development. It's more of that missing middle. So I know this is a horrible analogy, but I'm going to make it because I made a point to write it. But I kind of think of SEPA, right? It's a blunt tool. It's a good tool, but it's also kind of an outdated tool. So it's kind of like we're here in this chamber, and we keep the rotary phone, even though we all have cell phones and tablets and all of these things, to make sure we have something to fall back on. Again, I'm not saying, I know it's kind of a blunt analogy, but that's kind of the idea. We have so many different critical overlays to protect the environment in Issaquah. We now have an environmental board. We are now coming out with the ICAP, the Issaquah Climate Action Plan. There are a lot of opportunities, but there are not a lot of areas where we can provide incentives to developers. This is one of the few areas, which again, Washington State happens to be very environmentally aware. The state regulations are giving us an opportunity to raise those thresholds. And again, we're not talking about different areas around the country. Washington has some very strong standards. Governor Inslee's put in some very strong standards. So I feel comfortable here. This is one area where we can give back to the developers, encourage them and entice them to come into the city and develop some of that, the housing that we need here. So again, I may be an outlier, but that's my position when it comes to SEPA. I think we can go for the maximum the state has to offer, and I'm not even looking for the trade-off. I think the trade-off is the additional housing.
Are you advocating for an option of 1, 2, or 3?
I don't even think my option's on there. I think my option, the best thing I have closest to my option was column number 3, which was raising to the maximums, but it's still, I think, lead kicks in. Again, I can't quote it off the top of my head. But again, if I had my way, this is a democracy. But yeah, I would actually not even provide lead because, again, I think what we get in turn is the development. Now, again, like I said, there's a lot of overlays that protect. So yeah, I'm going to quit repeating myself.
I would have liked this bucket 6 to be able to have a joint session with the environmental board on this. And I would love for the administration to consider that as we move forward and we come back again with this at the second draft. While I don't mind doing questions and having our deliberations in one setting for us, I think when we talk about forested hillside preservation, when we talk about SEPA, these are questions that would we be really benefited from bringing in more voices and more expertise in our community. As a commission, I still stand by the idea that if we raise our standards to what the state has set, somewhere in between, that we're getting something from it. We know we need to drastically change the way that we build in this community, and we need to find a way for there to be some type of incentives and trade-off and balance. So I'm still in favor of this. I recall staff telling us that there would be other things that would happen without SEPA. For instance, when we talked about the effects of building, for instance, with transportation, right, of being able to have an effect on a community, and these other tiered effects that end up happening, right? And so we said, great, this is going to be focused on, so we're going to propose this one focus. It does make me a little bit nervous because the property is not just a building. It's so many other things. When we talked tonight about salmon safe, to me, it was like, well, salmon safe applicable to me says, well, groundwater, right? Everything needs to be salmon safe because there isn't just, if you're within a salmonoid bearing stream, it's how are you impacting groundwater runoff that ends up getting into those streams. So right now I'm a proponent of option 2, of raising it to the middle ground, but not to the maximums that are allowed from the state, because I believe strongly that what we have seen from a response from the community has been one that is backing environmental protections to a much higher standard. And so I don't see right now a movement within the community to be going to those maximums, but I do agree that being able to raise them is warranted. And I'd love to hear you guys' opinions about that.
We're referring to options 1, 2, 3, and we don't have the details available for us or for our audience. Is there anyone who could bring up that screen that has that chart?
I actually, too, want to make sure we're focusing our conversation. So there are a few things that we're probably getting into. Some of the carryovers really are going to go to, staff can't really help us out with some of those carryovers. So really, some of the things that we want to talk about are what has changed. Some of the carryover things, items, if I'm getting this correct, some of the carryover items that we have are literally, I don't think that's what we're trying to debate. I think those are some of the things that we're putting in, and then some of the ideas, the wish lists are going to that famous whiteboard. But I digress. Nina, please. Oh, Sarah, please.
Okay, so I can comment on the thresholds, or
Yeah.
that's within scope? Okay. So I fell somewhere like kind of in a happy, maybe it's not happy, but in a middle ground where I like there's a very stark difference, right, between what the thresholds are written right now in Issaquah and the state maximums as well as the neighboring cities, right? I think I don't have the table in front of us, but I know Issaquah was at like 4 units, the state was at 30, and then I think some of the neighboring cities really they're 20 or 30, right? So there's a really big difference between where we are and like what can be allowed and what is allowed elsewhere. And so I don't know if like a solution to that is like having almost like 2 tiers, right? That you can go up to the maximum if you allow or have some of the sustainable, the salmon safe and the LEED gold standards, but that there's also a level in between there where it's not like an all or nothing, that there is like maybe it's like a 10 unit or, you know, stick with the 4 or whatever it is, but that makes you exempt regardless. But you can go up to a higher level with those additional. I think to have like no threshold at all unless you have the sustainable development feels like it's even more restrictive than what we have now in some ways.
Do you, Chair, like us to stay on this topic and then move to another one after we've talked about thresholds, perhaps?
You're free to debate or discuss the entire packet.
Any
as
part
far
of the
as
section?
yeah, as far
Okay.
as
Okay, good enough.
SEPA.
I do want to refer to the document where it says, upon direction of the Planning Policy Commission, we've changed these exempt levels to the highest level. Now, I don't remember any of us supporting the highest level. Perhaps Chair Voice was, because he is tonight. But I really don't recall, and I'm sorry I didn't look back at my notes, that was the spirit of the day, and I don't recall it being the spirit of the public comments either. There were 2 things that I recall. One was that we wanted to have higher standards, lower thresholds, and the other was to be consistent. So there wasn't one threshold for this and another threshold for that and another threshold for this. And so, God, I'm trying to figure out my parking, you know, I do this, and I'm trying to figure out my setbacks, and I do that. And anyways, finding some way to harmonize numbers to make it easier for development. Now, on the note of being easier for development and to encourage housing in Issaquah Highlands, I do recall that our target numbers for our growth targets for the 2036 threshold are very low, and they'll all be in central Issaquah. Likely that they'll be in larger structures, not units of 4 or 10, but more in mixed use in our central Issaquah. At least that's what it seems our policy is directing our new housing to go. So with that, to change our threshold, we're talking about changing our threshold, we're talking about moving our threshold up. Why would we move it up? Well, I don't know. Most of those are going to fall under SEPA anyway. I am especially moved by the comment that Commissioner Lewis stated, which was also an echo of the public, to say, hey, building standards like Built Green or LEED or whatever standard we pick does not address all the environmental issues that we have in this consideration. So they don't replace. We use them as an incentivize, but they don't replace the SEPA checklist. So while I thought that was maybe a good idea at the time, maybe I'm on tape saying, hey, let's use the Built Green as an incentive. Now that I've seen it more fully, I'm not that in favor of it. And also, I would not be in favor of that if we increased our thresholds. Why have an incentive if we've already said nobody has to do the SEPA checklist anyway? So it would be more compatible to have the incentive if we kept to a low number, 4, 10, and then the corresponding commercial numbers that go with that table that is comparing us to other cities. So that's just kind of where I'm leading now. I'm a little surprised that this came out with the higher thresholds. I have one more comment, and that was to amplify a question made by Chair Voice earlier about the reasonable fee in this section, that reasonable does not define a standard, and we need a number of some kind, percentage of project value, or project cost would be one place to start. That's it for now until another one of you makes some brilliant comment that I've really missed.
I'm done with my brilliant comments. I realize that I'm the one reason we went down that rabbit hole. So would anyone else like to comment as far as the SEPA environmental policy?
I think it's fair to say that from where I'm sitting, the environmental checklist for that threshold determination is an entirely relevant piece of this. If I recall, when we were participating in the formation of the environmental board, that was a checklist that they were tasked with doing. And then as they've come online and as the boards come on board, they have realigned a little bit. And so I think it would be relevant when we're looking at this code the next time to have a link to the environmental checklist to better understand how that works when you're actually building, how that goes through, and whether or not it be included in the code or whether it's just an attachment for us to better understand would be appreciated, how that kind of ties in for me. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Moving on to forested hillside preservation.
Chair,
yeah.
Can I just ask a clarifying question so we can formally take Planning and Policy Commission's recommendation on this topic? I heard 4 different things, so I want to make sure that we're capturing it correctly. So previous discussions included Development Commission as well, and I think some of that, raise the thresholds was a nod from some of the joint meetings conversation that we previously had. Right. So at this point, I'm going to break it up into 2 parts. So just for the record, is there consensus on just raising the threshold from 4 to some middle, medium or highest point? Let's take a vote for raising the thresholds without tie-in, with the incentive for built green. Is there general consensus that we need to raise our thresholds or leave them the same?
Yeah, I think, like I said, I apologize. I think I'm the reason we went down this rabbit hole. Again, I know this has kind of been settled as far as what you guys were looking for. I might have been trying to sneak in my own prerogative once again. So. No,
but I'm not sure I fully understand is there a general consensus on raising the thresholds? The details of whether we tie in with the LEED certification or not, we can parse it out. But is there general consensus on raising the thresholds? I just want to capture it correctly for the council committee as to what your recommendation is.
I will go on record as saying that I understand the city's viewpoint about raising our SEPA thresholds and updating them. I do not agree with putting them at the maximum. So if we were going to raise them, it would be that tier of 10, 10, and that would help us to, what I would hope is to then be able to build that in with incentivizing for the missing middle. But at this point, my recommendation is to raise, but with green build standards. Whichever we do, I'd like to tie in to our housing goals. I'd like to tie into the way that we want to build as a community, and I think that this is a lovely carrot as a way to do it. And if the city wants to be more aggressive, I certainly would back something more aggressive about how we build green in Issaquah, even when you don't have a SEPA threshold. I think that this is a movement that needs to be exacerbated very quickly in the way that we build. And so if this is the softball way that we start it, I think that's great. Otherwise, I would not recommend moving the SEPA threshold to the maximum for this community.
So you're for tying it with something, requiring a built green or LEED certification, and with a mid-range, increasing the threshold to mid-range. And I think I heard one comment about perhaps not tying it with the built green for the existing thresholds, leaving them at 4, and 4,000. You don't have to build green. You're exempt from SEPA. That's the existing code. But from 4 to 20, you are exempt from SEPA if you are tied it with a built green. That was one suggestion submitted. Is there support for that?
Yeah, that was me, so I support that.
Yeah. But is there consensus among your fellow commissioners with that idea? So it gets, that idea gets you everything. It keeps the existing thresholds. It builds the next tier, but ties that with requiring built green or LEED certification. And then it's a mid of the range, not the highest threshold allowed under the state law, but the mid-range.
May I go? So do I understand that we would keep the threshold at 4 and whatever the corresponding commercial is?
4,000, yeah.
And if you become LEED certified with the standard that we choose, up to 10 and 10,000, you can do without the SEPA checklist. Anything over, oh, I'm sorry. Now I'm, so.
Anything over, you would require SEPA. So
Anyway.
It could be 10 units and 10,000 or 20 units and 20,000.
So if it were at
You can
10,000,
choose,
the
yeah.
incentive would be between 5 and 10, and 4,000 and 10,000, that group, talking about the missing middle, could be incentivized, and only that segment could be incentivized with a green building, and the lack of the SEPA. I cannot believe that the SEPA is that trigger for that, but I would listen to that and try to understand that a little better, but I'm really not interested in raising the threshold above 10,000, 10 units and 10,000. Anything over 10 units and 10,000 should be doing the SEPA checklist. I don't care what the building. That's kind of where I'm thinking, if you want some clarity.
Thank you. So it sounds like we have 3 votes for raising the threshold to 10,000 and 10 units or 10,000. So there is consensus for that raising the level to that level.
To that
Okay,
level,
thank
but
you.
there's also a consensus about requiring the incentivizing the green built as well.
Is there consensus on that?
Yes.
Okay.
And because I think, are you saying that you wouldn't even raise it past the 4 without that? Yeah, so there's also a variance right now. Nina is adding that on right now, right? She's saying that she wouldn't raise the threshold at all, Minnie. Are you?
I'm sorry, let me clarify. I would allow an increase in the threshold if you're green certified, but no higher than 10,000. It's that delta between under 4 is, they don't have it anyway. If you're above that, you might have to, but you don't have to if you do green certified, and above 10,000, you have to do a SEPA checklist anyway.
Okay.
That's an idea. That's the proposal I put out.
All right,
Is there consensus on that?
I think you have a majority. My comment is a moot point at this point, so we're going to move along.
Okay, thank you.
So we are now moving on to forested hillside preservation.
I'm going to start this discussion off with a positive. I really enjoyed this chapter. I thought it was very well done. I really appreciated the graphics. I thought it was very readable. I do have a couple comments. I would love in our intent section B, I'd like to add an 8 that talks about wildlife, habitat preservation, and wildlife crossings. I think are missing right now from how we talk about forested and steep slopes. It's not just about the canopy, it's also about the undergrowth, and it's also about how we interact as a whole in our forests, and I think that's missing right now from our language. And so I'd like to see how that can be included, and for me, the easiest way was to put that in with the intent B8. But obviously, if you think there's language that's more appropriate somewhere else, then please feel free. I will say that the idea of you know, we've had so many good conversations about terraced slopes, but seeing that picture being like, well, if you want your micro terracing, then you're taking out the whole hillside, for me was like, well, that isn't what we wanted at all. So I hope that the intent carries through as far as how we build. You know, a good example was Nina's question that we had about the tiered decking, right? What we want to avoid is having these big giant supports, these big giant cuts. We want to support building into the environment and minimizing that as much as possible. And, you know, I'm going to put a button in my TDR questions because I think that's really more appropriate for another area, but I do look forward to when we have it, when TDRs come back to us, bringing this part into the discussion, because I don't think we really talked about it when we did TDR. So it would be nice to kind of bring a full circle approach, I think, to that discussion is what I'm going to say. I feel like this code reads like the implementation of the policies that we've set forward. So that's a really big positive for me. But I don't really have a concept of how this is going to pan out into work product and how it's going to give us a result that we want quite yet. So good work, but I think that there's a little bit more to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I do want to thank the staff for this. I'm so excited to have code, because this was a policy that we worked on so many years ago, and what are you going to do with it? Wow, we think this is really important, but we didn't have anything to back it up. So really fabulous. Glad to see it. I think it's a great start, and we're going to learn by the things that happened that weren't what we intended. But I think Commissioner Lewis has pointed out already a gap in the terraced low walls that might need to, I think that needs to be reconsidered because of its lack of tree preservation on a forested hillside. And then fleshing out the language about the terraced deck, which just kind of leaves you wondering. Those are a couple of the high-level things that I thought could be improved upon, but I really want to thank you for this chapter.
I'll just plus one all that. I wrote down in my notes. I really like all the pictures in here. I feel like as somebody who does not spend their life in code, I really liked the pictures and helped me understand a lot about what was being said. It's maybe a question, so if I can't, maybe I'll try to disguise it as a comment somehow, but on the really big retaining wall, I agree with the knock the little terraces and then you knock out all the trees, but again, I live in Tallis, and there's a gigantic retaining wall by the new development, and it's orange. And so would just ask that, somewhere in there, there's somewhere in code, there's a design standard for what these retaining walls, if they are gigantic, should look like. Because in the winter, it's really stark. You can see it from all different points in the neighborhood. This huge, huge, huge retaining wall up at the top of the neighborhood. So we'll just put that out there.
Thank you, Commissioner Bader. Like you, I don't live in the code. So again, the graphics are fantastic. Reads well. I really enjoyed it. Just as far as my personal opinion, it looks good. Again, to Commissioner Lewis's point, the terrace slopes, that might have to be tightened up. I actually appreciate having some of the flexibility that was incorporated in here. So good job. Any other point anyone would like to make as far as the forested hillside protection packet? All right, moving along to accessory and temporary uses and sustainable micro infrastructure.
I'll go first while you guys rummage through your notes. This was pretty interesting, and I'm afraid I'm not going to do it justice for all that it really means. You know, it seems like little stuff. It's accessory and it's temporary, and I wish I could have spent more time with it because I think it is pretty substantial. And because on the memorandum it points to retaining community charm, and so I'm not quite sure if this does. Just throwing that out there, I was thinking, okay, well, where does this really retain our community character? But I did want to reiterate from my question period while we're looking at it, that some decks are allowed to be 3 feet from a neighboring property. I thought that was odd. It didn't matter to me how tall it was. I was surprised to see that, and Director Dollywall pointed out that there might be another standard that we could refer to that pulls that back a little bit closer to the other, which was 5 feet. And then the other comment I had to do with the temporary uses and food trucks in particular, trying to grapple with the private property 60-day limit. And if I understand correctly, this code is saying that if it's longer than, it can be there longer than 60 days, but then it falls under the use table. And will we be, are there any that are disallowed use? I should have asked that question, but it was our brilliant participants who came and testified during public hearing that pointed out that gap in my understanding about would a food truck be allowed, would a food service use be allowed in a commercial district, for instance, which might be where one of them is. And in that case, 60 days is only a administrative limit. You would just have to apply for a permanent location or a permit for permanent use. So anyway, I'm not sure if we have a problem here, and if the staff wants to clarify, because we did hear some interesting information from the public, I would appreciate that. Because I guess because it doesn't seem quite right to me that we would limit food truck locations for 60 days. It just doesn't seem quite right. I need to know more.
The 60 days would be in one location, and you could either, I guess, do both. If you're there for more than 60 days, you could try to renew your permit, or you could, try to request a more permanent location. But it's kind of gray right now. So again, looking for direction on that.
Valerie, do you want to actually put up your 2 questions, please? Policy questions.
While Valerie puts that up, I will jump in and say that I really appreciated the work that went into this. I think it is an excellent start because we've had several discussions in this commission about addressing this need in the community, and this is a great start. So I want to acknowledge that. When I was reading through, I did find it to be very limited to maybe more prescribed uses. Christmas trees, right, is a good example of something that pops up. If you have a different retail use, whether it's food related or not food related, I would like to see this community be more inclusive about how as a community we are dealing with that. So I'd like to have a little more language that talks about allowing retail in these micro pop-ups. And I think that there's an interesting argument to be made about things that are able to be moved, right? Whether they have an attached motor or they're on a trailer that then needs to be hitched. Because what if it's something where it's on a trailer so it's easily movable, but it's like a little shed, right? And so this is how you are able to operate your micro business. What I'd like to see us moving towards is a community that has more allowances for small businesses. We know that any type of, whether it's retail or food, this is a great incubator for being able to see if your business can sustain a more substantial lease in the community. And it's something that really can be used as a tool to bring community together. I think there's so many great examples in cities I've visited across the state and across the Pacific Northwest that have done a great job in both public and private spaces of joining together. So maybe what a big solution could be to this code right now is to have, for the 60 days, is to be allowed to file for another 60 days, right? And maybe we'll say you can do that 2 times, and then you need to actually have a more permanent location for the 1-year permit. But I do think that there needs to be a little bit more allowance, maybe, whether that's a one-time and then so you end up getting 120 days, right, if you reapply, or whether it ends up being 2 and you get 3. Especially because I think that when we think about a seasonality of summertime or a seasonality of the holidays, when we talked about festival lighting, I think is a good example of how do we make spaces that encourage community coming together. And I think this could be a great tool for that. I'd love to see the city actually propose a large lot where food trucks are welcome and food trucks are encouraged. So this code can be highly restrictive because this is where we find that it's best, right? I'd love to spend time talking about where I think that would be appropriate, but that's not what we're doing here today. Instead, it's to say that I think that there's room to add addendums to this, right? To be able to say, as a community, this is what we're going to do, and this is why this is more prescribed in these other areas. But without those other tools to this, it does feel a little more prescribed than what we were hoping to see. And so I don't know that helps you guys lead into a discussion, but that's kind of how I was feeling about it.
Anyone else have anything to say about, where are we? Well, first, the 2 prompt questions, or accessory and temporary uses. Commissioner Bailey?
Yeah, so I agree with Commissioner Lewis. It feels, if I'm paraphrasing her correctly, it feels, as it's written right now, to be a little limiting. I like the idea of kind of having options to extend it. I think we heard that from the public, and we saw a pretty significant amount of written comment as well on this. So it support kind of, again, options to make it a little easier to extend, but not totally deregulate it. On that point, the other, which I think is tied into question number 2, kind of thought that I had that wasn't clear to me and how it was written again, was on this requirement for a location and circulation plan for, and again, it read to me if you were there for more than an hour. And I think the nature of food trucks a lot of the time, so when you're booking them for an event, right, is that you're going to call up a couple of days before and say, hey, can you come to my event, for 4 hours, and that probably doesn't allow for a time for an official plan. So I think, I don't know what the threshold is, but I think if we're going to require that, it needs to be something that's more than a day, right? Because I think we're going to see a lot of, I could see that being really harmful to the businesses that do move around all over the place. So I'll stop there. I have one more thing to say on this section that I was just confused by. Okay. I'm gonna actually wrote down the numbers this time. It was just something that confused me as I was reading it. The list in the packet of kind of the applicable uses included, construction trailers or temporary office buildings, and that was listed right above the table that then had the 60 day, 7-day, whatever it applies to. And then later on down below, it actually said there's language that the construction trailers can be there for the duration of the project. And so it was confusing to me to have that in the list right above the table. So I don't know if it's just a matter of taking that out of the list, but that wasn't clear.
And if I can piggyback off of Commissioner Bader's comments, I do agree right now with the city's determination that in construction use that it should be on site. I had a hard time understanding why it would be permitted to be off site from your location. So at this point, I'm also agreeing with that recommendation by the city. I know that's not in our discussion, but.
Valerie, do you think you have what you need?
I don't think you guys touched on the second question, which is, should a business or a separate permit be required in addition to the business license?
Anyone like to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I think they already have a lot of permits, and the business license is local. It's the Issaquah business license. I didn't have enough information to say, oh yeah, another permit. What kind of permit? It just I would say no unless you told me something else.
I mean, because I think you're specifically talking about private residences in that it's zoned as a residential area.
So
right?
The second permit would be basically for anyone, if it's private property or well, actually in the right of way, you require a permit anyway.
Right.
So if it's for private property, you would be required to get a second permit. Right now, the only permit that we require them to get is the city business license. But we actually don't track that. So we don't know how many food trucks are currently in the city. We don't know where they are.
I don't either, and I like food trucks.
So the separate permit would allow us to track that and also give us an opportunity to kind of evaluate, you know, where they are on the site. Does it make sense? Are they taking up parking spaces? Right now, it's just kind of, oh, I'm going to operate on this property. I have an agreement, and go and operate.
And my question is, does the intent end up then being stopping it from regularly occurring in residential areas?
Food trucks are not allowed in residential areas at all.
Right, so, but if they are operating in a residential area, we wouldn't know, because that's what I'm saying, is does this solve that problem? Is that what it's intended to try to?
Yes, it would help, but if someone's gonna break a rule,
they're gonna break it regardless.
They're gonna break it regardless, and then we just have to try to get code enforcement.
Well, I appreciate that explanation, Valerie, because yes, I think the more information, the better. I'm surprised we are not able to keep track. So yeah, I mean, we need to know exactly what's going on in our businesses. So yeah, I think a resounding yes for number 2. Again, it's not necessarily for the fee, but yeah, we should absolutely have an idea of where businesses are operating in the city. And I think part of maybe the misunderstanding came from a particular public comment who mentioned that he was operating in residential areas, which again, I'm happy to hear is not part of the code, because that kind of goes, I think when we're talking about private property, we're talking about, privately owned property. I won't use the example he used, but you know, a particular gas station that has that food truck there for a while, they have a private agreement. So yes to number 2. Private property, like I said, I tend to try to want to be hands off on that, but definitely should have an idea who's where and who's there.
I mean, I think it's fair too for the code to be saying the difference between a mobile and immobile unit, right, for the micro housing as well. That I think it could be addressed too, right? Even if it's on a trailer, right? The ability to move something versus so easily is something that I think our code, the next draft, could address, of how we want to be prescriptive and where we want to be prescriptive.
Well, since you mentioned parking, which was in my notes, how else do we regulate whether the parking that was required for a commercial use is actually still performing to the level that it was intended? And as parking kind of the new gold going forward, if we're going to try to limit parking, because we don't want to designate that much space to cars, it's more and more valuable. And then when people use it for other uses rather than what we intended them to do, because we had a minimum parking regulation, I could see that. But you should know, doesn't a business license say where you are operating your business?
Depends. So there's a lot of food trucks that come in and operate for maybe a day, like Costco. They rarely have food trucks that come on their site and just operate for a day. But for some of the more permanent locations, like the gentleman who spoke, he's going to be located at the Grange. So yes, his business license clearly says I will be operating at this location. But if they're coming in for a week or an event, we don't know where they're going to be operating.
Yeah, I think what's interesting here, and I don't want to talk too much longer, but I think you're getting an idea that needs a little work, but you're on the right track, is that it's the property owner whose requirement is being curtailed by the use on their land. And so maybe the more of the burden goes that way, and if we flipped the script and looked that way, what would we see? Who would what if they had the requirement to say, I am dedicating a certain portion of my land to a use, rather than the burden on the small business owner, food truck person? And then back to the, it wasn't clear to me that the renewal of the 60-day, and it, you know, we could just have it, it's every 60 day and it's renewed as long as forever. And then because of that renewal, then the city and whoever else needs some kind of control and oversight would have it every 60 days. So maybe that's a good happy middle there.
Well, I think there is no renewal right now, so that was something that we had talked about. So is there kind of a consensus right now about allowing either a one or time use for the 60 of being. So I think what's interesting to take back to you guys is in having it less prescriptive. We just had such a good discussion about shared use parking and being able to have the city as this third party of saying, here is some sort of business, I'm thinking of, dentists and things that are vital to a community that are located in prime transit locations, but that don't use their property during certain hours, right? And being able to have an agreement so that we're actually having an outlet of saying, no here, but this is where, right? And trying to actually have a little bit more of a sense of this is where we want this, right? And so the same way that we love when you guys give us maps and intent and being able to say, this is why we want to put it like this, because here's the flip side, right? And kind of having that second part of it. And because we're going to be so prescriptive here, this is another way that we can go about it. But we certainly don't want to be overly prescriptive, because the whole point of this was to be able to make it easier to do it in our community.
Great, thank you. All right, any other comments as far as accessory and temporary uses and micro infrastructure? We're gonna move along to through block passages. This was, I think, the smallest bit of code.
I love the idea of through block passages when doing these prescribed communities. And communities that I've lived in before on the East Coast, when they would do through blocks, they were always places that were easy to know that it was for pedestrians only, because there was often things like community natural gas fire pit set up. There was games, right? Community games, cornhole, and things like that were built into the infrastructure. So it was like basically these like little festival streets is how they were, and they really helped have a place for community to come together. And I think that that's what I see as being a real benefit of through block passageways. Now, if we're instead looking at them as a more multimodal, right, keep cars away, then I think that's a very different thing. And so I kind of want, I would like to see how we use the through block passageways to make more of a community space, right? We talk a lot about green spaces that are required when we put up. I don't want to take the place of that. What I want to do is have these as an addendum of how we're adding more space, right? We talk about, I think there was like a bench every like 25 feet or something like that, right? How do we build in these things, right? So I appreciated that the code added things like signage, seating, lighting. But another thing that we always talk about with through block passages is how does the public know that they are invited into that realm? So it's not just signage that is within the community and within the development, it's without the community of knowing that this is something. So that can be hard to kind of know this is a private space versus an open community space. So I think that that's something that, while there is language about signage, that I think maybe we could be adding to that a little bit. But I do wonder if we should be doing it everywhere. And so I'd love for us to be having a conversation of that central versus citywide.
So Commissioner Lewis just pulled at my heartstrings. She mentioned the aesthetic quality of having through block passages, because I typically think they add quite a bit of value. I have a friend who has one. The only reason it wouldn't is if it leads literally to a cul-de-sac, but I guess for that particular set of housing, it might. So I'm generally in favor of them. Now, whether or not the widths and things, I imagine staff has already worked that out, looking at other different cities and seeing what their standards were. So I'm sure those numbers are probably right where they need to be. I'm generally in favor of through block passaging. I would kind of, looking at the two policy questions, I kind of lean towards number 2, which would be to kind of look out throughout the city where we can do this, because again, Commissioner Lewis, knowing me well enough to know that having the fire pits and the festival streets, again, those are the things that drive community. And there's an opportunity here to do it not only in just newly built subdivisions, but throughout the city. The one that I have a little bit tougher time getting around is redevelopment. But I guess that would be part of it, right? Because if you don't do it in redevelopment, you're never going to see it done, because the subdivisions just don't come up that enough, especially in kind of the areas where the map lays out. So again, generally in favor, completely in favor, not generally, completely in favor of through block passages. I think they add value to the community, the neighborhood. It drives community. So I like it.
Yes, ditto. Number two, for short, yeah, number two, yep.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, the questions are different. The first question is in the development of subdivision only. And another place that we've used through block passages is with large commercial developments such as Costco. And that was critical and very important. And one of the more maybe important place to put it because of the massing of those buildings and the impenetrable structure that these large things can be. Has anybody tried to walk in Washington, D.C.? Oh my God, it is like a forever to get to the next block. And that's what we're trying to prevent against. We're trying to create a pedestrian-friendly and connected community. So I would say that in the answer to question one, if I'm understanding it correctly, is that we should require through block passages, period. And then is the standard based on a map, or is it based on a tolerant distance between a through passage of any kind? And when I'm looking at what we used to have and what we've had in Issaquah Highlands, and I think in Tallis too, we had 200 or 250 feet or whatever it is. But the risk there is that you could be requiring a passage that doesn't go anywhere. So I like the idea of the map, but I like the flexibility of just saying that a certain block is too long. So if there's some way to combine those things, that would be nice to give the developer flexibility to state what is important. What is important is that we don't have to go too far before we can turn and change direction, especially as a pedestrian or a disabled modal person, you know, whatever the motivation is that we're trying to achieve or accomplish. So some kind of combination between a minimum standard and a map. And then back to the neighborhood plans, you know, this has been a part of Issaquah Highlands standards, and I'm hoping that we don't lose those standards in the overlays. So when we look at overlays for Tallis or Issaquah Highlands, if you can keep these standards there, then you only have to do the other neighborhoods that don't have these standards. So I don't want to have to go back and redo Issaquah Highlands because we already have it.
Any other feelings as far as through block passages? Say that 3 times fast. Valerie? Excellent. All right, well, that takes care of the deliberation portion of tonight's meeting. Going once, going twice. We are moving along to the next item of regular business. This is fun. Vice Chair. So as we all know, we recently had Mr. Monahan, Vice Chair Monahan, depart. His last meeting was 2 weeks ago. So we currently have the Vice Chair position open to fill. Like to try and see if we can get something here tonight, but I will go through the procedure. It's a very similar it is the process that we conducted in May, but basically what we're going to do is first I will call for any nominations for anyone who would like to be Vice Chair or thinks someone may be good in the role. When all nominations have been made, we'll close the nominations. If only one nomination is made, you are it. You've been elected. And if there are multiple nominations, we will hold time at our next meeting to have a proper vote. Now, yes?
Does the nominee have to accept the nomination because of what you just said? Just by
Yes,
nominating?
absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
We are a commission of 4. We don't have a lot of leeway here. No, of course they don't. If for some reason someone wants to turn down the nomination, we can try again. See where we end up. We'll see if that happens. So right now I'd like to see, I don't know if there's any formal language, Stephen, or, yeah. Would anyone like to nominate someone to be Vice Chair of the Planning Policy Commission? Commissioner Milligan.
I'd like to nominate Commissioner Bader.
All right, are there any other nominations for Vice Chair? Does Commissioner Pater accept?
No way, no, I'm just kidding, yes.
Well, thank you. All right, well, thank you, Vice Chair Bader. Yeah, wonderful. Reports, we're moving on to reports. So we have some city council updates that I'd like to ask staff to provide if they have any, which I believe there's Ms. Dollywall.
Yeah, good evening again. So we did have a discussion with the committee of the whole. So we've been taking all the buckets that you all pass on to a council committee. So that happened on August 4th with the Planning Development and Environment Committee. They had good discussion on those topics. They wanted some more feedback on the parking topic. But then we also gave them the whiteboard list. I think there was a question earlier asked about what's the process for that. And we did have a conversation with them. I'm going to post in your chat over here. Hopefully everyone can get it. So that's the link to the August 8th council of the committee of the whole meeting, where we included the whiteboard that we currently have. The committee asked us to put it in the goals. What's our desired outcome? How is it tied to existing codes and policies? Is it covered under the goals and outcomes chart? So that council could prioritize some items with a focus of the budget cycle of 2023 and 2024. As you know, the city council is going to start working on the budget for in a biennial year, 23 and 24. So there was good discussion at the council level on the whiteboard. It includes all the items up to bucket 5. So as you all deliberate on bucket 6, we'll add additional items that might come in. Like we discussed, the wireless facilities and others that might come in with the bucket 6. So given the lateness of the hour, I don't want to keep you from getting home, but you're welcome to look at the list and reach out if you have questions or want to talk further.
Chair Voice, just to clarify, we'll send you an email with the link because I know you can't see it right now on your screens.
Oh, thanks, Stephen.
The lateness of the hour, indeed. Thank you, Minnie. Finally, do we have any other business or announcements from our wonderful staff who've been tremendous tonight, Valerie or Stephen?
No other announcements.
I know everybody wants to stay here, right? Okay, there being no further business before the commission, we adjourn the meeting at 9:17 p.m. Good night.